GenTAC data and biospecimens using BioLINCC. For this webinar, we will use the Q&A functionality that's built into Zoom to field any questions you may have for today's speakers. Please click on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions, and we'll cover them at the end of the session. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Dr. Kathryn Holmes is an expert in echocardiography in patients with congenital heart disease and fetal cardiology at Oregon Health and Science University, or OHSU. She completed general pediatric cardiology fellowship and dedicated echocardiography specific training in congenital heart disease at Johns Hopkins. Dr. Holmes is intimately involved in the preoperative evaluation and postoperative assessment of children with connective tissue disorders that require cardiovascular surgery. Dr. Holmes was a co-PI for the NIH-sponsored Registry of Genetically Triggered Thoracic Aortic Conditions, or GenTAC, at Johns Hopkins University. OHSU was a participating center. The registry has enrolled over 3,000 participants and collected medical, genetic, and phenotypic data, as well as imaging and biospecimens. Thus, Dr. Holmes has extensive experience with enrolling and managing clinical studies, as well as experience with data collection, imaging evaluation and registries, and working with research coordinators. She was also on the steering committee where she directly participated in the development of research protocols with a diverse group of geneticists, imagers, surgeons, and cardiologists. Currently, she is a member of the GenTAC Alliance, which is an extension of the original effort, and is on the clinical science and biospecimen subcommittees, where she is co-chair of the latter. She is also on the steering committee for the Collaborative for Longitudinal Aortic Research in the Young, or CLARITY. She is an expert in bicuspid aortic valve and has co-authored several papers regarding bicuspid aortic valve in adults and children. She is actively interested in how exercise affects the aorta and how limitations on exercise may impact obesity of children with congenital heart disease. Dr. Holmes, thank you for being part of this webinar today.
Thank you so much.
Next, I'd like to introduce Cheryl Maslen, PhD. Dr. Maslen is a professor emerita with the Knight Cardiovascular Institute, also at OHSU, where she served on the faculty from 1991 to 2022.
Hey, Lauren, can you,
yeah.
Sorry to bother you, but can you advance your slide one, please?
Thank you.
There we go.
I appreciate that.
Cheryl.
Sorry about that, Dr. Maslen. Dr. Maslen's research was on the genetic basis of congenital cardiovascular defects and rare disorders, including Marfan and Turner syndromes. She served as one of the founding principal investigators for GenTAC and was director of the OHSU GenTAC Regional Clinical Center. In her research, Dr. Maslen conducted 4 NIH-funded studies using the BioLINCC resource. She continues her work as a member of the GenTAC Alliance, including as an expert in biospecimen and data acquisition from BioLINCC. Dr. Maslen, I also thank you for being with us today. I'd now like to turn things over to Dr. Holmes.
Okay, great. I'm going to just share my screen. All right, just as a quick check, you guys see the whole screen?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So first question that we had is sort of what data is in GenTAC? And GenTAC's a longitudinal study. It was observational, it's a cohort study of affected individuals with known or suspected genetic mutations that predisposed them for thoracic aortic aneurysm and aortic dissection. Not everyone in GenTAC had a genetic diagnosis at the time. It was started in 2006 when even Loeys-Dietz was not, and TGF-beta receptor mutations were not yet fully understood, let alone the ability to be able to test for them. But however, in anticipation of those future discoveries, we included serum, plasma, DNA images, surgical dissection events, clinical events that these patients had over the course of the study. Our goals were to follow them approximately every year to 2 years, and those that had a predisposition for more events were followed a bit more closely. Our study dates were 2006 to 2016, and our average follow-up was about 3 to 6 years. There were some that came into the very end of our study, which probably only had 2 years of follow-up. The total number of patients were 3,500. And so one of the things that you want to understand is how GenTAC is organized if you're thinking about using that particular database. One thing that I wanted to mention was that images were actually acquired in the second half of GenTAC, which actually included patients of their initial studies, and they were de-identified and sent to MedStar core lab for separate analysis. The data that you will get out of BioLINCC, however, does include those core imaging data. So those are read by a core lab. The actual images are not kept in the BioLINCC registry at the moment. Blood draws were performed on site, spun down, and some were sent to NHLBI for processing. There's also 7 data collection forms, and this is particularly important because if you're thinking about which patients you want and how to hone your data, you'll actually need, instead of just going straight to the data dictionary, I would suggest looking at the enrollment forms, as they have definitions of the enrollment, patient questionnaires, family histories within that, and you can decide which of the selected variables you want. You can see that there's 8, actually 10 total forms, so that the data is very rich and complex. Form 1 enrollment is a full general history of events. Form 2, which is particularly of importance, includes pregnancy data. That pregnancy data is also in a follow-up form, so if patients had pregnancies after the enrollment of GenTAC, we wanted to collect that. The imaging evaluation form is essentially the data. Initially, we put that data hand entered in, but then when we had the core lab, those forms were substituted with the data that was done specifically by the imaging core lab. And obviously there's genetic and biochemistry and blood chemistry reports. Some of that genetic data includes CLIA approved labs, and some of it includes CLIA not approved labs. That data is in fact there, but it tends to be a little spotty. Form 7 is our surgical and percutaneous interventions. Form 8 is if a tissue specimen was collected at time of surgery. That's where we put the data into that. Obviously an off-study form for death or someone who wanted to remove themselves from the study. And our follow-up form is what we use, which is pretty much a recapitulation of the enrollment form. We wanted to know if there was any changes that occurred over the course of that, over the course of the study period. But I encourage you, if you're interested in using this resource, to spend some time looking at these forms, because again, and the forms are documented with what the variable labels are, and you'll need those in order to be able to make your query. In terms of what's in there, these are the big numbers. There are some patients with smaller numbers, but BAV with aneurysm is the largest number, followed by Marfan's. We also have a fair number of Turner's populations, Loeys-Dietz. Now, Loeys-Dietz 1 could also add some of the TGF-beta 1 or 2 mutations, but as this particular group is classified at this time, they were separated. So sometimes when people are interested in looking at Loeys-Dietz or TGF-beta 1 or 2 mutations, you can actually combine those 2 variables. There's another group, other less than 50. I think that's now known as non-syndromic thoracic aortic aneurysms and dissections. So at the time, we were using a different vocabulary and a different language for those patients, and now it looks a little bit better from that point of view. We have imaging data. There are at least more than 8,000 images, greater than 5,000 echocardiograms, because everyone who was entered had to have at least one. And if they came through follow-up, would also have another. At MRI and CTs, we have at least 2,000 specimens. Those are ballpark actual numbers. The blood specimens, these are ones that were actually collected. Cheryl will talk a little bit more about blood and tissue that's there versus ones that were initially collected, because obviously this is a static slide. And once those resources are used, the numbers are a little bit different. And I have 2 asterisks. One is that the imaging data is now housed at UT Southwestern, I believe. And the blood specimens are still at BioLINCC. There may be more than one place to go. Just to give you a little sense of what aortic events are in GenTAC, there are a number of type A dissections, B dissections, specific ones that are involving more of the aorta. And this is just to give you a sense of what's there. and aortic valve surgery as well. So there are a number of outcome events in GenTAC. There's also outcome events, as I mentioned, pregnancy. There's outcome events of other surgeries related to potential eye surgery, spine surgeries as well. But if we're just focusing on the cardiovascular complications, this is sort of a rough estimate. We did take data on whether someone had a myocardial infarction, a stroke. That data is also available. So that's when we're talking about just thinking about what data is there, less than the tissue samples. And I'd like to turn it over to Cheryl to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts related to how you actually get information out of BioLINCC, how you make a request. And I'll turn it over to her.
Thank you, Kathy. I am going to now share my screen. And what I'm going to do is actually place us into the BioLINCC website, because that's where all of the information that you need to know is housed in terms of what you can access and how to access it. And how to access it is very important because it's a process. It's not just a request for samples or data, and then that's it, that you receive them. So BioLINCC is actually the custodian of all of these samples that were collected in GenTAC. That means that they have a role of responsibility in protecting those samples and not wasting them, because although the data is there and will always be there, the biological samples are a limited resource and they will eventually be depleted by research studies. They want to ensure that the research studies that utilize these resources are actually geared to success. And so there's a process that you go through in applying to BioLINCC. So stepwise, let's walk through how this works. So number one is that when you look for BioLINCC, you can just Google BioLINCC, BioLINCC, and it will be at the top of the page. But if that doesn't work, it's at biolinc.nhlbi.nih.gov. And that pulls up this homepage for BioLINCC. And one of the first things that you'll want to do is walk through this page to see what the resources are available. And I would really encourage you to explore it thoroughly because, as I said, this is a process. It's not just a request. And so you want to have in mind that this is going to take a bit of time in order for you to access these samples or data. There's an About BioLINCC tab that we won't go into today, but it just gives you the facts about how it is put together and what it is. But I'd encourage you to at least probably start with the biospecimen and data resources. There's an overview. There's a link to studies that have been performed. There's teaching data sets, other things in publications and non-BioLINCC resources. But this is a good place to start just to get an idea of what is there in BioLINCC. BioLINCC is not just a registry of GenTAC. It actually contains many, many registries that have been done through NHLBI. And so there's a lot of information here. Really important here are the procedures and forms. And so Kathy talked about, I would suggest that you download the BioLINCC handbook because it is a wealth of information as to what goes on. But there are also things like form templates. And so you want to take a look at those because there's the data request form, specimen request form, specimen and data request forms, and biospecimen collection application form. So most of you will not be doing the number 4 because that's when you're putting samples into BioLINCC. But the other 3 are the things that you'll go into in order to access resources through BioLINCC. Also, there's agreement templates, and these are important because this is a research distribution, materials distribution, and so an RMDA is required for accessing these, as is a material transfer agreement. And so you need to work with your institution in order to access these resources through BioLINCC. The other thing that you'll want to do very early on is to register with BioLINCC, and that puts you then into a situation where you have now a BioLINCC webpage of your own. I will share mine with you so that you can see what it looks like. Here we go. And so mine is populated with a lot of information because I've had numerous studies with BioLINCC resources. But this gives you the history of what you have done or are going to do. And it keeps up to date in real time. And so it talks in particular, the request name, the study, which is the study you're going to be doing, who's the requester, the things that you're requesting, data and specimens or one or the other. But the status is what keeps getting populated over and over again. As you move through the process, you'll see that you have different situations. I don't have anything that is active right now, but if you did have, it might say in progress or in process. And it will take you all the way through from the request being made to when it's fulfilled or closed for other reasons. As you can see, I had 4 studies where the requests were fulfilled and the studies were funded and completed. Others, things like closed, request not funded. So I put in an R21 to NHLBI. It did not get funded, but it did have a letter from BioLINCC saying that the specimens were going to be available to me should this be funded. But in their role of responsibility, you have to demonstrate that you have funding for the study, because otherwise it's likely that the specimens will be wasted, and that's something that they try to avoid. Closed for other reasons. This is a study that I closed for my own reasons. But so this is what this looks like. But in going back in the process, and I'll back out of here and back to the forms, one of the most important things to know is that when you do this, you are actually going to have to do a lot of back work in order to get a request funded, or not funded, but I'm sorry, approved. And so let me share here the data request form. So one of the first things that you might want to do is that you fill out some of these forms, and you'll see that there's a fair bit of information that is required here. Personal information about you, the support type, what institution you're at, the number of years in scientific research, is there funding available, what's the funding, what's the extramural award, and so quite detailed. And then the request details. And this is essentially a protocol of your study. You have to give them a lot of information here in order for them to assess whether or not this study is geared to be successful and is important and meets the mission of NHLBI and GenTAC. And so this will include things like your design and analysis plan. And this is not trivial. This has to have sufficient detail in it. And this is something that you're going to be doing for your grant anyway. And so it's not wasted effort. It's just that you're doing it in advance, because a lot of times what you'll want to have for a grant submission is a letter from BioLINCC saying that yes, these samples are available, and yes, they will be made available to this individual investigator for this specific purpose. So you're moving into an agreement where you have a very specific reason for requesting the samples. You have the funding to do the study, and you have a sufficiently robust design and analysis plan so that the project has a good chance of being successful. And then there's some security questions also. All of this ensuring that these samples are not wasted and that they will be available to the most robust projects that will support this. And so this is the data analysis, but the same is true of the specimen request form, or oftentimes what it is, a specimen and data request form. Very, very similar templates for this, but you need to use the right one because it has somewhat different information. But all of the elements that protect the samples are here. And so this is a little bit different because since you're looking at data specimens or data and specimens, that what you want to be able to do is to say the number of specimens, the type of specimen, exactly what you want. Are you requesting DNA? Are you requesting plasma? What exactly are you asking for? The amount of DNA that you need if you're requesting that. Different parameters to be tested, the type of assay platforms to be used. All of this to make sure that what you're looking at is a situation where the samples are going to be used appropriately and will be successful in that. Rationale for the number of specimens, biospecimens requested, including power calculations, is essential here because once again, we need to ensure that this research study is appropriately powered and geared towards success. And so there's also a process that if BioLINCC doesn't have sufficient numbers to make your study successful, do you have other resources? What are those? How would you commingle samples, and what the implications of that are? And so this is all the kind of thing that you're going to be spending some time on before your request can be completed. Once you submit these, then you will have your BioLINCC page, my BioLINCC, go back to my page, and your study will be listed, the type of information and samples that you're requesting, and the status. And like I said, the status gets updated on a regular basis as you move through this process. So those are sort of the nuts and bolts behind making a request to BioLINCC. It's important to recognize that this will take some time. So you want to time it appropriately. If you want a letter from BioLINCC to support a grant application, then what you really need to do is get this process started about 4 weeks in advance so that they can work through it, do the analysis of their own data collection, so that they can determine whether or not the appropriate samples and the appropriate numbers are available there for you. They'll look at your protocol and make sure that it's a robust study design and data analysis design. And then they'll go through the vetting process of saying that, yes, this is the kind of project that is appropriate for these BioLINCC samples and data, and then they'll go through the process. In terms of obtaining the samples, that's another thing that takes some time. And so you wouldn't expect to get the samples for like 5 to 6 weeks after the request is approved. And so time yourself appropriately so that you aren't caught short on time when it comes to making this project of yours work and be successful. So I will stop sharing my screen there, and I believe that we will have time for questions. Turn it back over to Lauren.
Thank you. That's right. Thanks, Dr. Maslen. If anyone has questions, please use the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen.
Cheryl, while people are collecting their thoughts, I have a couple of questions for you. One, in your experience with working with BioLINCC, you said that at some points it's sort of a conversation, a back and forth. What, in your experience, are you anticipating that they would have some clarifications about the study? And I'm assuming that their overall goal is to make your study successful. So is that something that you would anticipate in the process?
So there is the opportunity for back and forth. In one instance, it was after I had received samples, but a couple of the samples were damaged in transfer. And so I had the opportunity to then go back into the BioLINCC portal, and there is a place there to communicate and say, this is what happened, can we get replacements? And that was then a very fast back and forward, that they confirmed that there were additional sample available for me, and they were able to put that request into the organization that actually physically manages the biospecimens and get those shipped. And so there is opportunity for conversation. You can start out just by asking them, do these samples exist any longer in BioLINCC? Because sometimes some samples may have been depleted. I don't have real-time numbers on what's available and what's not, but you can put in a request for information without going through your entire protocol first. You can ask just generically, do you have Turner syndrome samples available still, or something like that.
Great, thank you. We have a few questions that have come in. The first is there any cost associated with the request process?
There is no cost at all to the investigator. This is funded by NHLBI. And in fact, they go a step further. There are actually regular R21 opportunities available to individuals who want to use specimens through BioLINCC. And so, and those are listed on their website. And I'd pay attention to those because it's a unique funding opportunity. And of course, it's a fairly small pool of applicants compared to a lot of funding opportunities. And so free to you, and possibility of having some additional funding opportunities available.
That's great information. Thank you. Can for-profit companies receive samples from GenTAC?
Actually don't know the answer to that. Do you, Kathy?
Well, honestly, I think it depends. So definitely something that we talked about in our, when we were creating GenTAC. One of the questions that was related to that on our consent form was whether samples could be sent for further development. I don't remember offhand the exact language that was used, and however, there would be some availability of consent for some of those samples if the patient said that it was okay for them to do that.
So I just went back and looked in the BioLINCC website, and what I'm seeing is that there is a box that can be checked saying that it's going to be used for commercial opportunities. And so I think the answer is yes, and that it will be scrutinized, obviously, but I think that the opportunity does exist.
Great, thank you to you both. We've got a question about elaborating on those potential funding opportunities that you referred to, Dr. Maslen. If there's any more information you can share about those.
I believe that those are, there's an announcement that's sent out by NHLBI every time the funding opportunity is available. And so it's whatever resource you use to look at funding, it's right there, but it's also listed on the BioLINCC website. There is a tab that says funding. And I believe that they're 3 times a year. There are all R21s. And the one requirement is that you are using BioLINCC. And so this is a situation where you would want to be in contact with BioLINCC in advance of grant application so that they can provide you with a letter saying that, yes, the resources that you've requested will be available to you upon funding.
So helpful. Thank you. Let me see. There's one more. Oh, Dr. Grima actually posted in the chat the link to the R21 funding opportunity.
Thanks, Joe.
And then I see one more question. Could you talk us roughly through what analysis is sent back from BioLINCC once a proposal is approved?
Yeah, I'll do my part of it, and then Cheryl, you can kind of add. I'm almost interested in what the questioner is interested related to analysis, because BioLINCC is not providing analysis of the data or the samples. They're providing the raw materials to you to be able to answer your question. So in terms of would they be doing some specific statistical analysis, the answer is no, unless you had specific funding for that available. But so that I'd like to have you probe a little bit more and refine your question if there's something more that I can answer with that. Cheryl, what about from the specimens point of view?
Once again, there isn't really any analysis that's done by BioLINCC. They're providing you with the biospecimens for your analyses that you're going to be doing. And they, one thing that could happen is that they might probe a bit deeper if you if your study design isn't explicit enough that they are understanding. That's another opportunity for back and forth. They're not going to just tell you no, that we're not going to do this. They're going to ask you questions of, can you provide more detail about one aspect or another? And so I think that there is a lot of opportunity, at least in my experience, there was some opportunity to actually learn from BioLINCC as to what it was that they really needed to have. And it helped refine my study design, and helped me refine my grant application with their feedback. So it's a great resource that way.
Yeah, and I want to be specific. I mean, it's not as though BioLINCC is, you're going to say, I would like all of the variables, the entire data set downloaded to me. And I can come up with the questions as I go. They want you to hone your idea, figure out what your idea is, figure out which data elements you're going to need in order to answer your question, whether that be a specimen versus data related to imaging. Ask the right question and you'll get the right data out. So then you can do that analysis on your own.
Great. Thank
And
you.
I should note that this is something that Cheryl mentioned. When you go to the BioLINCC website, there are a few hundred studies there. It's not just GenTAC. And so that's one of the advantages of using this particular system is the support structure to try to make sure that instead of getting all of the data just given to you in a big data dump, it's focused for the questions that you're interested in asking.
Great. Thank you. We have one more. Can these samples be used for studies that are not related to cardiovascular diseases, or are they available only to those who are interested in genetic aortic conditions?
Well, GenTAC was structured to study genetically triggered thoracic aortic disease. And so that's its purpose. That's the mission of GenTAC. And so I think that being good stewards of the resource, BioLINCC would probably look at a protocol and ask if it is addressing somehow the mission of NHLBI, which is really the ultimate goal here. So I don't have a really straightforward answer to that, but it certainly was constructed for the study of cardiovascular disease.
Great. I don't see any other questions coming in. I'll just pause for a moment in case anyone's feverishly typing.
I mean, I think it's a great resource. I think it's a resource that we have that still has some potential, even if it is a few years old at this point. There are many questions that we didn't get a chance to ask, and there's still questions that are coming up now that we're looking for data sets to be able to corroborate. It may be a good data set, for example, if you want a comparison group. And you're looking for a specific comparison group, that data there is relatively robust. And we are using it in some of our studies in children as a comparison imaging data for some of the modeling that we're thinking about. So there's a lot of different potential options that you can do. There's a little bit of natural history. There's also in there, the patient's forms talked a lot about how they saw themselves with their disease. So there's some other sorts of things that might be available that you wouldn't really think necessarily on the top of your head.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to thank our speakers, Dr. Kathy Holmes and Dr. Cheryl Maslen, for such great presentations that will undoubtedly help others with their research efforts in genetic aortic conditions. If you're not yet familiar with the GenTAC Alliance, please check us out at gentacalliance.org and join our email list. Also, we're launching a new Alliance website later this year, so be on the lookout for communications about that. Any parting words before we close?
No, I mean, as Cheryl was talking about, you know, the entire goal of this was to try to get this out to the public so that many different investigators and scientists and new people can be thinking they're having the opportunity to use this resource. And we really just want you to be able to do that. And certainly feel free to go to the GenTAC Alliance website. You can contact myself, Cheryl, if you have specific questions related to BioLINCC. And we're more than happy to help walk you through the process.
Absolutely. And thank you all for joining us.
I'd like to add one other thing about the images. They are now with Siddharth Prakash, and he's going to be putting them into a sort of database that will be outside BioLINCC, and we'll see if we can somehow combine the two. But if you want images, there'll be a separate process there. You can either contact us and we'll figure out how to get those to you.
Yeah, Joe, that was the one thing that I touched on really lightly because I know that that's an in-process area. So I don't want the audience to get particularly frustrated with that. There are images there. There's some hiccups related to actually being able to use them yourself at this moment in time. The data that was done by MedStar in terms of the core lab, that's solid. But if you would like to have those images, just like you would like to have a biospecimen for your own analysis, that is going to take a little bit more work as hoops. Now, as hoops as we sort of evaluate how to get that out to the public, but it's certainly something that we'd like others to be able to use.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.